At this moment, there are about 13,500 nuclear warheads spread across the inventories of 9 nuclear states, according to the Arms Control Association. This is a staggeringly large amount, so large, in fact, that it's difficult for us to grapple with the scale. In the 1980s, a grassroots organization called Beyond War devised a way to represent the scale in a way we can understand. The nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima, known as Little Boy, had a yield or explosive power of 15 kilotons, equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The detonation of this bomb vaporized, poisoned, and burned 150,000 people. This BB represents that explosion. The average land-based warhead on high alert in the United States has a yield of 280 kilotons, or 280,000 tons of TNT. The total yield of nuclear forces kept by the US and Russia on high alert, ready to launch within minutes in a crisis, at the discretion of two men, Trump and Putin, is about 1,185 megatons, or about 1.2 billion tons of TNT. It seems absurd at face value, but the decision to keep such enormous arsenals at the ready was not an accident. Instead, it was the product of a calculated gamble that two states with the capacity to eradicate the Earth would never go to war or launch an attack against the other for fear of what retaliation such a move could bring. However, with the consequences of a deterrence failure so potentially devastating for humanity and the world, many question whether nuclear deterrence is truly a recipe for world peace, or if it is, in fact, a game of Russian roulette, whose terms must be fundamentally changed if we are to avoid the worst. Welcome to the Bluegrass Debate Coalition's primer on the November 2020 topic for Public Forum. The United States should adopt a declaratory nuclear policy of no first use. In this video, we'll break down what no first use is, some of the concepts underlying the debate about no first use, and some of the arguments for and against no first use. But before we talk about no first use specifically, let's talk nuclear deterrence. 1945 was a pivotal year in 20th century history. It was the year World War II ended, topping off a half-century that killed tens of millions of soldiers and civilians on the European continent and around the world, and giving way to many decades of strained peace between the world's great powers. 1945 also marked the first and last use of an atomic bomb in combat. According to the theory of nuclear deterrence, this alignment between great power peace and the invention of atomic weapons is no coincidence. Instead, atomic bombs are the reason great power war is too risky for great powers to attempt. The logic is simple. To effectively deter an opponent, a state must make an attack seem so costly that it is not worth whatever gains an attack could bring. This involves communicating two things to an opponent. First, the strength to retaliate for an attack, often called capability, and second, the will to retaliate for an attack, often called resolve. At the most basic level, this dynamic works to prevent war. If both sides believe that the other will destroy them in the event of a conflict, neither side has an incentive to initiate a conflict. This concept is often described as mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. Destruction is mutually assured not only because of nuclear weapons themselves, but also because of a concept called nuclear winter. The idea that ash created by megafires caused by nuclear explosions would rise to the stratosphere and blot out the sun, causing a devastating global famine that wipes out most, if not all, of the war's survivors. If the story were that simple, there would not be much to talk about with nuclear weapons. Nuclear-armed states would never go to war, and the world would generally be stable. Unfortunately, the story is far more complicated. The problem is that deterrence is not an objective state of reality that can be measured. Instead, it's partly a psychological game, the point of which is to make your opponent believe they will suffer unacceptable costs if they do something that is undesirable to you. Dr. Strangelove, a nuclear scientist in Stanley Kubrick's satirical film about nuclear weapons, said it best.
That is the whole idea of this machine, Deterrence is the art of producing in the mind of the enemy the fear to attack.
As a result, the challenge goes beyond simply having the capability and resolve to repel or punish an attack. For deterrence to work, a nation must also convince its adversaries that this is the case. This means that, like any human communication, deterrence can break down when two sides misunderstand or don't trust one another. There are many ways this could happen. One side could incorrectly call another side's bluff, launching an attack on the assumption that their opponent's strength and resolve are weaker than they claim. This type of miscommunication can cause war. Deterrence has failed, and the country making the threat now carries it out. In addition, one side can correctly call another side's bluff, refusing to be deterred by a nuclear threat. This puts the country making the threat in a difficult situation. It could concede, revealing its weakness and potentially emboldening future challenges, or it could respond, starting a war. Either scenario increases the chances of confrontation. Nuclear scholars call this dynamic, where states are forced to carry out a threat they never intended to carry out, a commitment trap. A third way deterrence can break down is when one side believes a war is inevitable and believes that whoever strikes first in this war will have an advantage. In this scenario, threatening more damage to an adversary could actually be counterproductive, since they believe they will inevitably suffer that damage in a war, and the threat might make them more convinced the war will inevitably happen. If they believe their only chance to reduce the damage they suffer is to strike first rather than back down, a deterrent threat could actually increase instability. A fourth way deterrence can break down is when the decision to start a war is not up to humans at all, but when a technical malfunction causes states to start a nuclear war. An early warning system could pick up an attack that isn't actually there, or a computer may communicate a nuclear launch order that was not actually sent. In either case, deterrence has failed, because the fear of war did not prevent a war from starting. The US and Russia, the two greatest nuclear powers, are of course aware of these problems, and have taken a variety of steps to reduce the risk of deterrence failure. They've opened lines of communication to raise their level of trust between them. They've enacted agreements allowing both sides to observe and verify the strength of their nuclear forces. They've also passed arms control agreements, limiting weapons that are destabilizing, hoping to convince each other that a war is not inevitable. The US even gave Russia money after the collapse of the Soviet Union to help the new government secure its nuclear arsenal, hoping to prevent the theft of weapons or their accidental launch. But the inherently uncertain nature of deterrence also incentivizes states to behave in potentially dangerous ways to get a leg up on their adversaries. The main way states do this is by taking steps to make nuclear bluffs more credible, hoping to force a more favorable resolution to any international crisis. To do this, states build up their nuclear arsenals, they build smaller nuclear weapons that can be used in more situations, as well as larger ones that can inflict more damage, and they engage in a strategy called brinksmanship, escalating crises to the brink of war to prove their willingness to risk nuclear war. In sum, nuclear deterrence is imperfect. While it has prevented war so far, its continued stability depends on how nuclear states choose to communicate with one another, and whether they can avoid irresponsible and destabilizing behaviors. It is on this background that debates about no first use, or NFU for short, have broken out. First, what does it mean to adopt a declaratory nuclear policy of no first use? Let's break it down. The United States currently reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in a conflict first, even if another state has not used them. By contrast, under a declaratory policy of no first use, the United States must declare or formally announce its policy or its operating rule or principle of not using nuclear weapons first in a conflict. In other words, no first use takes a first strike off the table, reserving nuclear weapons for retaliation against a nuclear attack. A similar, though not exactly identical concept is the idea of a sole purpose declaration, which states that the sole purpose of the US nuclear arsenal is deterrence, that its purpose is not winning battles between armies through tactical use, nor is it winning a nuclear war once such a war breaks out. What are some of the arguments in favor of adopting a policy of no first use? The first argument concerns deterrence stability. Recall from earlier the ways deterrence signals can be misunderstood. A state might incorrectly call a nuclear bluff, starting a war. A state might correctly call a nuclear bluff, forcing the threatening state to choose between inviting further aggression by conceding or starting a war by fighting back. A state might strike first because they believe a war is inevitable, or a nuclear war might break out because of a technical glitch or an accident. According to proponents of NFU, all of these risk factors are reduced when states renounce the first use of nuclear weapons. Such a policy reduces the risk of accidents, since it incentivizes states to take missiles off of high alert, and it makes states more likely to second-guess false alarms from their early warning system, since their adversary has renounced the idea of striking first. It also reduces adversaries' fears of a US first strike in a crisis, removing their incentive to strike first while they can. It also reduces the chances of an adversary calling our bluff, since the threat to fire the first shot in a world-ending nuclear war is inherently less convincing than the threat to retaliate against a nuclear attack that's already happened. This credibility problem is particularly severe in the US, because the US has threatened nuclear first use not just to defend itself, but also to defend US allies, an idea known as extended deterrence. The problem came to be summarized by a simple quip: the US won't trade Washington for Warsaw. Proponents also point out that nuclear deterrence would not be compromised by an NFU because nuclear retaliation would remain on the table. The US has so many nuclear weapons, many of which are hidden on nuclear submarines and almost impossible to destroy in a first strike, that any adversary who attempted a first strike would face certain annihilation, regardless of the US declaratory policy. Non-nuclear threats, they argue, can be adequately faced down through non-nuclear force. After all, the US is the world's largest military and can more than match any opponent in a non-nuclear war. A second argument for NFU concerns non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The United States is one of the loudest voices on the world stage calling for states to forego the development of WMD, imposing sanctions on states that acquire nuclear weapons. However, NFU advocates argue that such leadership is undercut when the US refuses to renounce nuclear weapons themselves due to the hypocrisy of denying nukes' usefulness to others while taking advantage of it ourselves. Some go so far as to say that nuclear no first use can serve as the first step to nuclear disarmament, since it confirms the strength of what some nuclear scholars call the nuclear taboo, the international understanding that using nuclear weapons is morally illegitimate. A third related argument for NFU concerns norms of nuclear non-use. This argument contends that other countries imitate US nuclear policy, and that a US NFU policy would lead to other nuclear states, like China, Russia, India, and Pakistan, adopting NFU policies of their own, bringing stability to conflicts in which they're involved. Opponents of NFU bring up a variety of downsides to such a policy in response. First, they argue that NFU actually undermines the stability of deterrence. The threat to start a nuclear war might not be 100% believable, but it's believable enough that the horrifying scope of the consequences we threaten gives our adversaries pause. An NFU, however, would assure a competitor like Russia or China that they can escape nuclear punishment as long as they don't use nuclear weapons themselves. NFU opponents argue that this increases the chances of a Russian attack against NATO or of Chinese aggression in a regional territorial dispute. Opponents also say that the risk of deterrence failure under current policy is overstated, pointing to a 70-year history of relative stability in which nuclear weapons have never been used. Furthermore, opponents argue that NFU undermines deterrence against non-nuclear threats, such as biological, chemical, or cyber weapons. Remember, since none of these weapons are nuclear, an NFU would prevent the US from retaliating with nuclear force against such attacks, even if they managed to kill millions of Americans. NFU opponents argue that forswearing nuclear force in such a situation is unwise, and encourages terrorists or rogue states to attack us without fear of retribution. Second, and relatedly, NFU opponents claim this policy undermines damage limitation. This idea refers to the use of nuclear weapons to preemptively destroy the missiles of an adversary if we discover we are about to be attacked, with the goal of limiting the damage to the United States. Under an NFU, the US would be forced to do nothing until the attack began, increasing the number of American deaths. Third, they argue that NFU increases the risk of proliferation by undermining assurance to our allies. Recall the US policy of extended deterrence, the idea that the US will retaliate against attacks not just on its homeland, but also against attacks on its allies. Opponents of NFU argue that such a policy would make our allies doubt the credibility of US commitments, forcing them to think about new ways to defend themselves. Many of our allies, such as Japan, South Korea, or Saudi Arabia, have considered building their own nuclear weapons in years past, and NFU opponents say that only the American promise to come to their aid has prevented them from doing so. When President Obama considered adopting a declaratory policy of NFU in 2016, it was primarily this fear, that of proliferation from a reduction in Allied assurance, that persuaded him the policy was not a good idea. Finally, opponents argue that adopting an NFU would be pointless because no one would believe it. They point to historical examples of states undoing their NFUs, such as Russia, and point out that states, and especially adversaries, tend to assume the worst of one another. There is no doubt that NFU is a complex topic, with a lot of moving pieces. Let's talk about how you can cut through the complexity to highlight the most important issues in any debate. There are two core issues that any pro or con team must master on this topic. The first issue concerns the current state of deterrence and assurance. Is our current policy working, or is it failing? Debaters on both sides should be able to speak to how foreign leaders perceive the current mix of US capabilities, statements, and commitments. Does Russia believe the United States might use nuclear weapons to defend NATO? Does North Korea or China think we'll risk Armageddon over South Korea or Japan? Why or why not? What about our allies? Do they believe us? A debater who successfully proves their side of this argument will likely win the debate. First-use threats are unlikely to do much good if no one believes them. An NFU is very likely to be destabilizing, however, if first-use threats are currently working to deter our enemies and reassure our allies. The second issue concerns the structure of the international order. Do norms and persuasion matter, or do states respond purely to power? If the US can lead by example, the potential upsides to an NFU become much greater than they otherwise would be. If power always wins the day, on the other hand, an NFU would more likely be seen as an admission of weakness and an invitation to aggression. This video has only scratched the surface of the debate about NFU and US nuclear posture. However, if you master the concepts described in this video, you will be ready to speak confidently on most of the core disagreements surrounding NFU. Good luck in your debates, and for more information and resources on the topic and on public forum debate, visit bluegrassdebate.com.